Hello everyone, it's Lynn Cremando for Yoga U Online, and I'm here today with Celeste Mendelsohn. Celeste is an IAYT certified yoga therapist, a yoga and meditation teacher, and she specializes in working with people recovering from trauma and substance use disorder. And in those areas, she has studied under some of the experts in the field, including Durga Leela, Nikki Myers, and Hala Khoury. Celeste's first foray into yoga was to gain relief from physical pain. But through yoga, she also found a deep spiritual connection through meditation, movement, and breath. Growing up with substance use disorder and trauma in her family, and then again in some adult relationships, she found that a regular yoga practice really enhanced all areas of her life and also tapped into some of the healing properties that you would find in a 12-step program. So this led to kind of a natural evolution in her work in which she weaves together 12 steps, spiritual practice, trauma awareness, and movement, breath, and meditation. As a therapist, Celeste works with clients either one-on-one or in small group settings in both inpatient centers and outpatient programs for substance use disorder. She also periodically conducts workshops for people in recovery and their families. And a large part of her mission is to create greater awareness around the knowledge of the efficacy of yoga as a complementary modality in the treatment of substance use disorder and the resultant trauma it wreaks among whole families. So Celeste, thank you for your work and thank you for talking with us today.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm glad to be here.
You know, there's a lot of interest right now in the yoga community in trauma. They either call it trauma sensitive or trauma aware yoga. Now, when you are teaching yoga or working with clients in treatment centers for substance use disorder, clearly your antenna for underlying trauma is up. Mm-hmm. But I have recently read that in excess of 20% of the general population is walking around carrying some residual trauma in their bodies or in their, emotional, psycho-emotional bodies. It sounded like a really high number. Does that number sound right to you?
Actually, it sounds low to me, but yes, those are the numbers based on a study that was done a number of years ago by this is in partnership between CDC and Kaiser Permanente, where they worked with 17,000 individuals that were Kaiser members, and they created a series of 10 questions, which they called the ACEs test, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study test. And that test was designed by them to determine how many people had these 10 issues within their family systems. And they acknowledge, if you look at the ACEs website, they do acknowledge that there are many other types of trauma that happen to people that are not included in this ACEs exam, but it was done this way because these were the questions that came up most often through the people that they were working with. So they used these 10 questions. And what they found was that I'm trying to remember the number, but in essence, what it came down to is that 20% of the people that were part of their study had at least one yes answer to these 10 questions. And of those yes answers, 84% of them had more than one. And the study group was interesting because the study group was made up of all Caucasian middle class Kaiser Permanente members. So what they did was they took that kind of that section of society and created this test toward them. What that doesn't account for, of course, is people of color or lower or higher, for that matter, socioeconomic background. So they really haven't hit the full spectrum of people that would perhaps be in a yoga studio, which is kind of where we're at, right? So
Yeah.
We have students that come in that don't fit that particular quantifier, and we don't have any idea where they would rate. So in fact, in my opinion, it's probably higher.
Yeah.
But there's no real knowledge of that. The thing that strikes me, though, is when you get 20% of the population, even if that number were accurate, it's a large enough number in my mind that we really need to address that in the work that we do within the studio.
You know, there are trauma sensitive classes that are special classes, but what you're really saying is that in a regular class where the teacher doesn't know the backstory, where people are dropping in, there could be someone in the class who's a trauma, in some stage of trauma survival. And how does a yoga teacher who doesn't have all these backstories go about creating a class that is safe for everyone?
And I think that's really the key. It's, you can't ask, we do ask generally, I would ask a new student that came into my class if they had any issues that I needed to be aware of. But that I may get an answer about a sore rotator cuff or a lower back injury, right, but they're not going to tell me, oh yes, I witnessed my mother being beaten when I was 5. That's not going to happen. So no matter the due diligence that we do as teachers with our students, we're not going to likely get the whole story. And we may not likely get the whole story even in our regular students that walk into our class on a weekly or multiple times a week basis. So that being said, we can't rely on information from outside to keep these people comfortable and safe in our classes. What we have to rely on is ourselves. And in order to do that, we really need to re-educate and retrain teachers in how to address these sensitivities in their classes on a day-to-day, everyday basis. It's the way that we talk. It's the way that we move or don't move. It's the way that we express ourselves, not using overly imaginative, flowery language can actually be very helpful, because people who have trauma issues it's easy for them to zone out on stuff because they're having a hard time paying attention anyway. So when you say things, talking about the beautiful energy that's flowing up the spine and blossoming in your head, it sounds lovely. But if I have PTSD or I'm a trauma survivor and you said that to me in a class, dissociation is likely. I'm going to be going, what does that mean? How does that, what, huh? And so I'm no longer paying attention to you. My mind is gone with that thought. And the next thing that you tell me to do, maybe the next several things you suggest that I do, I'm going to miss the instructions. And if I miss the instructions and I realize everybody else is doing something and I'm not, what comes up for a trauma survivor is shame. Because I'm clearly defective. I'm missing, so I can't do this like they're doing this. And so it's important to watch the way that we speak. It's important to watch the words that we say, the inflections that we use. It's also important to pay attention to where we are in a classroom. People who have trauma issues need to know where we are. So if we're walking around the room, which is that's kind of the thing that people want to be, I want to walk around the room and stand next to the student and walk over here and do this. That can actually be very disconcerting for students that have issues with trauma because they don't know where the teacher is. They don't know where they're going to show up. We are the figure of authority in the room. And having a figure of authority show up by your side when you don't expect them can be frightening.
So are there a few tips that you might give to people as a general rule? Like quit walking up behind people and offering a suggestion from behind, I think might be something I infer from what you just said. But are there ways that you can, I take it that a lot of people don't want to talk to you about it, especially if they're new. Are there ways that you can surmise that someone needs to be treated especially compassionately or carefully, or I'm not even sure what the word is that I need to?
It's difficult because you don't really want to be singling people out in a classroom situation anyway, because then they feel weird, right? They're the odd man out. So it's difficult. But if we can adopt a way of speaking that generally everyone can be comfortable with, then we have a leg up on it. But yes, you can tell if you know what to look for, and it's something that I talk about in the course. So if you have a brand new student that comes into your class, they're hanging out by the back wall, they don't make eye contact. When you go up to talk to them and introduce yourself, they're looking down, and they're either nodding their head and not talking to you, and definitely not meeting your eye. That would be a clue to me that something is a little off, that something's challenging for them. Maybe being there at all is challenging for them. And I know that to be true. So, the fact that they managed to walk in the door can sometimes be the bravest thing that they've done all day, right? It's like, oh, this is so scary. So if they're there, the best thing we can do is keep our voice level and be compassionate. Speak to them in front of them, never walk up beside them, as you said, that's important, or from behind. Be in their in their vision when you come up to talk to them. Get their attention, make sure that they know that you're there. Speak in a soft and gentle voice, but you want to be heard. So if you're at the front of the room and you're demonstrating an asana pose, you want to make sure that your voice carries, so that you're not so soft that they can't hear you. In general, it's about finding that middle level so that you can communicate with your students in an effective way, as directly as possible, with a minimum of distraction, so that they have the best chance of picking up on what it is that you say.
So research shows that people who've been traumatized are likely to have a distorted relationship to their bodies, that they maybe, as a defense mechanism, disassociate from their bodies. And so there's a somatic disconnect going on. How do you start to bring a felt sense back to someone who's maybe their mind and their body are in different zip codes? How do you create that felt sense from someone who's been avoiding their body?
Well, here's the thing. We can't create it for them, but we can facilitate it. We can show them the path to walk down. Whether they walk down it, we're not in charge. But yes, the idea is to, rather than use the flowery language like we talked about, maybe you would say if you're bringing your students into a warrior two pose, press down through your back heel. All right, so you've got their back heel, and okay, press down through the back heel. Notice the sensations in your foot and your leg. Press down through the ball of your right foot, and find your body's balance in the middle between the two, so that they get an idea of where they need to be in space. And they can start to maybe begin to understand that there's feeling and sensation in their foot and their leg, because you've brought attention to it, because you've talked about that. So as you cue them with these things in class, not always, like I said, dissociation happens. Not always are they going to go, oh, I felt that, but they may. And if they do, that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
You know, the word that came to my mind when you were saying that was titration. That
Mm-hmm.
almost what you're saying is, you know, this is very specific. The ball of this foot, the heel of that foot. It's not, as we said, go out into the seventh chakra and find the glowing orb, but it is
Right.
a very tangible, finite place where you might begin to sort of titrate in some sensation as it becomes safer.
It's about it's allowing them to find awareness in a place that's comfortable. And if they're comfortable in your class, they'll come back. And if they come back, then they'll get a little bit more next time. You know, we can't hope to win the battle in one session. The best I think that I hope for is that there's a light that might go on, that, oh, there's something there, I want to do that again. I had a lady that was in the military in one of my classes where I live. I'm near a naval base, and I had one of the ladies that was on base came to one of my classes one day, and after class she came up to me, and I'd had her in a class before, but this particular class was a very, very slow move. It was a kind of a slow hatha, mindful flow sort of a class. And I have a couple of students in that class regularly that I know that are also in 12-step rooms. And so I kind of try to weave a little bit of that kind of, you know, feeling in the body sort of things into that class. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, I've never experienced a yoga class like this before. And I said, okay. I said, and was that a good thing for you? How did you like it? And she said, I want to know what to ask for in a class, because I want to know what this is that you did. And, you know, I gave her the schedule and I said, this is what it's called and this is what it is. And she said, I found myself at one point in the practice when you said, I don't even remember now when you said this, I realized I had tears flowing down my face and I didn't even know it. I don't know what happened. And I said, you know what? That's okay. That happens. She said, yeah. And she's like, really? That's not weird. I said, no, it's not weird. It's fine. You know, what I found out later about her is that she had just come back from overseas duty in the Middle East. And so she'd been part of some pretty intense experience. So, you know, these are people, and by the way, the ACEs test does not account for military issues, PTSD. But so there we have somebody that doesn't fit that, but yet is still in my classroom. And she got a lot from it because it brought her into her body, probably for the first time in a long time.
Is empowerment a piece of this? It feels like what you're saying is, you know, if you've been disassociated, it's like you've relinquished control. And go ahead.
Yes,
that's my question.
I would say that's true. And the thing that's interesting is often people don't even realize that they have relinquished control. What we'll talk about in the workshop is that fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And when we get to the point of freeze, where the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are both overloaded, the body stops.
Yeah.
You know, and there's just like, there's nothing. It's numb. It's numb. That's, you know, so when you're numb emotionally and physically, when you start to recover some of that, it can be painful. And they don't even know why. And they may not understand what it is specifically that's being accessed, but it's pure emotion at that point. And as they start to feel, it is a sense of empowerment because they find they get themselves back. get a piece of themselves back that they lost, that they didn't even know was gone.
So you've created a teaching methodology that you call, I'm going to say it correctly because I know it's Sanskrit and I'm not a Sanskrit scholar. I want to say yoga tarana.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, am I in
Yes,
the?
that's correct. Yeah, you're in the ballpark. Yeah.
That it kind of follows your belief that people can recover from these issues. What are some of your go-to tools? And I just want to mention that you've referenced a class. We'll talk about that in a second. So
Okay.
anyone who's listening and saying, what is she talking about? We'll get there.
Okay. All right.
So tell us about the teaching methodology and how you've created.
How does that weave together?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of it is really what we've talked about. So it's about changing the way that we say things, modifying our tone of voice, being more direct and specific about the things that we say, the poses that we use, being very aware of the poses that we use, because some of our poses, frankly, can be very triggering. And if you know that, or you suspect that you have people in your class that have trauma issues, you may want to rethink some of the poses that you use. I had a student in a class at one time who I was having to move into cat cow, and this was before I recognized that she had a trauma issue. This was actually how I figured it out. Because she was on her hands and knees, and I was asking them to go to cat cow and look down at their knees and then look up and arch their back and this and that. And her comment was, I've never done anything like this in a setting like this before. And I looked at her and I said, are you uncomfortable with this? And she goes, well, yeah, a little bit. And I said, okay, so sit down and do the same motion. So I had her do a seated cat cow. That was actually in a recovery class in a treatment center, but I was not aware. I didn't have any information in her background that said anything about specific, sexually specific trauma. I made a point of going to the counselors after our session to tell them, because I believe that they didn't know. I believe that they didn't know. When I told them, they were surprised. I mean, the looks on their face, I don't know. I didn't get into the details with them, but they looked surprised. They were like, you're kidding. And I said, no. I said, my belief is that there's a trigger here for her. You guys, this is in your hands now. You get to look at that. And they did, and they worked with her with that. That became part of how I look at that, is that this was my contribution to this woman's recovery, was the awareness that there was a problem. Okay. So it really makes a difference. And that kind of awareness, and bringing that awareness into even into our regular classroom settings, can shift people's lives. It doesn't mean that we're going to fix them, but we may give them a light in the darkness so that they have a direction to follow. And it's the little things that we do and the little awarenesses that we have about how we interact with our students, what we wear, what we say, how we approach. Do we assist? Do we not assist? Do we do hands-on assists? Do we, how do we approach that? Yeah. All of these things make a difference, and it's all kind of woven into the practice. I mean, I'm not going to say that I don't do cat-cow anymore, because that's not true. I do. But I'm aware of the students that I'm doing it with. Sometimes I'll do a seated cat-cow. I'll just start there, because I recognize that there can be issues.
It's you must work with people in this realm who've had years and years of talk therapy, who've spent years and years in a linear way telling the story, living the story, reworking the story with words. And it seems like this cat-cow brought out a facet of this story that this woman wasn't even aware of in some ways.
I think she might have been aware, but she hadn't shared it, at least not with these particular counselors. And it wasn't until it was brought forward that they thought to dig a little deeper, and they did. And, I found out later that one of the other things that I typically, I'll share this. This is something that I always use in classes when I'm asking people to come into Shavasana. A lot of times closing your eyes in a space that you don't know with people you don't know around you is a very scary thing. It's another place where you might find your students are like this. They're lying there trying to pretend they're in the moment, and their eyes are wide open. So what I will generally say is, when they come into Shavasana, so, okay, so bring your eyes to half mast with a soft gaze, or if you prefer, close your eyes. So they have choices. When I first said that to this woman, she sat up and she said, "Is that normal?" and I said, "Is what normal?" And she said, "Is it normal not to want to close your eyes?" And I said, there's nothing attached to that, right or wrong. It just is. And if it's uncomfortable for you to close your eyes, don't close them. Just let them be soft. So I play it off. I'm not going to go, "Oh yeah, it means you've really got a problem." So no, but what I will do is encourage them to do what feels comfortable for them, so that they can be okay with what it is that they need for themselves right now. That may change in the future, but for right now, this is fine. You don't, and so that non-judgmental attitude, I think, is one of the big pieces. So there's not a wrong way to do a yoga pose, as long as it's safe, right? So if you've got your knee hyperextended, yes, I'm going to say something. But when I have students say in a Warrior One, instead of saying, "Now make sure that your left hip is even with your right hip and in line with your mat," what I will say is, so notice what happens if you bring your left hip forward. Notice the sensation in that hip. Be aware of what that feels like down the leg. Notice if it increases the stretch, if it's more comfortable, less comfortable. Be aware, because that's an opportunity for them to find connection. And so that way, rather than it's got to be like this. It's a different approach.
This sounds so fascinating. So you are going to be teaching a class. Is it 2-part or 3-part?
It's 3-part.
A 3-part class at Yoga U Online, called Teaching Trauma-Aware Yoga, Creating a Healing Space. And I assume you're going to go into much greater detail into all of this.
I am, yes. I promise.
So it sounds like something a lot of yoga teachers ought to, including myself, ought to be tapping into, because so many things you might not attribute to a triggering event that could be an inadvertent trigger.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. What I find is that my regular students respond very well to it also. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it isn't really like we're teaching to a special group of people or a special audience, and the other students are going to go, "Oh, why are we doing it that way?" They love it, because having that awareness about what it feels like in this leg, and how that sensation affects my right hip, and how it feels to press back into that left heel or whatever, is really the essence of what I think we all want from our yoga anyway, is that sense of connection to self. It is, in my perception, what yoga was designed to do, which is bring us back into ourselves, bring us present and here.
And given the popularity of yoga now, and that you have no idea who's coming into the room, it just sounds like a lot of tools that you're going to cover in this class are the kind of thing that would create a safe, enjoyable class experience for a variety of people, not just people.
And I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Well, Celeste, thank you so much. I've learned so much.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So we'll look forward to seeing your class soon on the roster. And for everyone tuning in, thank you. And we'll see you again very soon. And for Yoga U Online, saying good night, goodbye for now.
Bye.
Bye.